And Joe Walker, Arrival, I believe, is your first foray into science fiction. So what are some of the challenges of working within that genre?
I think it's the fact that for the large part of the shoot, the only thing I had, the two of the main characters, was a man in a green latex suit holding a large pole with a rubber ball on the top. It took a certain amount of imagination. I mean, it's not a good look, do you know what I mean? But for the grace of God, why? But, no, I mean, it was, do you know what I think the big difference for me was? It's a different attitude. It's almost like post is a continuous shoot because you're constantly generating new content. I mean, we started in July and sort of 53 weeks later, we dropped in the last shot of Louise, some VFX on her hair, CGI hair. So it's a long process to kind of keep the clay wet all the time. It's not like you shoot everything, you stop, you cut it, you consider it. It's the first assembly is missing two characters, and we had to build it up piece by piece.
Mm-hmm. Well, it's also your second outing with Denis Villeneuve. You'd worked with him on Sicario, so this is like back to back. Going into it that closely. In fact, I remember when I was talking to you about Sicario last year, and you were in the editing bay for this film. So talk about going from back to back with both of them.
You know, the craziest thing, we went back to back from Sicario to Arrival, and now back to back to Blade Runner. So it's been, you know, I feel like sometimes I wake up in the morning and go, "Morning, Denny." It's like, but he's the loveliest guy to hang out with for a long time, and it's a great relationship that we've built, and very trusting. And you know, there's a lot of shorthand that arrived very quickly. I mean, the funny thing is, during Sicario, I would hear these occasional conversations in the background of the cutting room, rather muted conversations with the concept artist, and I'd hear Denny saying, "Perhaps we should consider it's not having eyes," or something like that. And it's very tantalizing. I had no idea what the project was at all. He was just well into development, and you know, they were waiting for dates. So it's kind of, I had this inkling of what was coming up next. But no, I mean, I really love him like a brother, and there's a kind of, he has phenomenal ability as a director. I mean, he's got his own particular way of creating tension in a scene, and Sicario, I'd seen that with this sort of long 15-minute build-up to a very short shootout, and a sort of rather love for the dark and grotesque, and he's always wanted to do science fiction. It's been a lifelong dream of his, and you know, he's as, you know, as they say, as happy as a pig amongst the acorns.
You mentioned the build-up to suspense in Sicario, and I'm thinking about Arrival now and the build-up to seeing the aliens for the first time. So there's a lot of similarities in that. Can you talk a little bit about creating the build-up to and creating tension in moments like that?
Well, I think the choice was made it's a very kind of, I think it's a relatively grown-up way of doing exposition in a film, which is, you know, Denny had made a choice. He wanted the aliens to arrive pretty much on a Tuesday, 11 o'clock, overcast skies, and for it to be an ordinary day, and for everybody just to be knocked, you know, 5 foot to the left without even realizing it. And so there's a kind of way of telling that is peripheral. I mean, for example, we had a news report of the first shell landing. The first vision of the shell is, you barely see it because we're playing it mostly on Louise's face, and then in the lecture hall, and then we come around and show a tiny glimpse of it in the background. When she's back home, she scrolls through the news channels, and you get a tiny glimpse of these things hovering over the ocean, but you know, she's scrolling through the channels. And in fact, what we're really concentrating there is her being, you know, the wide open space outside her house with the lake. So it's kind of this gradual exposition that sort of piece by piece you build it up, and then you tease as much as possible. I mean, I love the work we did on the dictaphone. There's a moment where Colonel Weber comes around, and by then you know it's pretty well established what's happened. But she's gone into work anyway, the only person to go into work. We sowed the idea of what the heptapods sound like But also we sow the idea that there's not a communication going on. It's not a question and answer rhythm. So using editing rhythm, I suppose, even in the sound, you're suggesting a disconnect and you're suggesting what this woman's task is, and it feels insurmountable. There's a suspense and tension when you're piecing together what's going to be there, and people are kind of telling you, basically, wait until you get there, and I can't describe it, wait until you get there. And then we really tease out that moment when they go into the tunnel and the gravity walk, and that's really, we're stretching time quite a lot. I mean, I don't think a skylift can go quite as high as that one. It's a kind of movie skylift, But it was really trying to build that sense of, an oppressive pressure on this woman in a hazmat suit, hearing thousands of voices, disconnected voices from the army base, the radio transmissions, and we're always trying to tell things from her point of view. And the editing just matches up with the kind of way it was shot. The idea, another idea that was there was this shallow focus. I mean, Bradford Young, amazing cameraman, and he has a very, it's 1.9, which means, one side of the face is out of focus and the other side is in focus. So it's always trying to kind of build it around Louise and building a sense that she's adrift because of maybe grief and because she's a woman on her own.
Right, and one of the interesting things about this science fiction film is that it's about this woman, Dr. Louise Banks, and her dealing with events in her own life. But it's also about all of the things that we never see in science fiction films. Usually we just go straight to pyrotechnics in these kinds of films, but this is all about discovery of language. Can you talk a little bit about that?
Well, I think, the great promise of this script when I read it was that it's a strong female lead. I mean, it feels almost incredibly timely that this film comes out the week after the election. There we are with a film about, a strong female lead who's educated, and that's not derided. A message of unity and discovery of differences between ourselves and tolerance of each other. I mean, it's an extraordinarily timely event, and I'm so pleased that it's done well, given that. But no, I mean, the other approach is, this probably drives VFX companies to madness, but, the idea is sometimes the focus is on her and not on the background, which is this giant black granite egg, like a symbol of death hovering over her. That's out of focus in the background. What we're concentrating on is the wind whipping through her hair in the foreground. It's a kind of very poetic way of putting those things in the background, so you just buy them. It's an understatedness in the storytelling and in the VFX and the approach of the filmmaker, and particularly of Denis, that I think sells it. And they coined the phrase dirty sci-fi. That's what they were describing it as.
Mm-hmm. There's also within the film a kind of a tricky editorial job that you have to do, and I don't want to spoil it for anybody who hasn't seen it, but suffice it to say you're using flashbacks and interspersing little clues within the film. Can you talk a little bit about the challenges of doing that?
I mean, there's sort of two worlds that collide in this story, and it's based on, there's two sort of sets of material, if you like, and they both look very different. There's a very intense mother and daughter material that was shot on this very beautiful lakeside home. And the colors are very sort of sherbety and, it's very impressionistic, poetic. It's got a flavor of Terrence Malick, it's got that kind of flavor. Very close and intimate material. And that was some of it was scripted, a little bit like non-zero sum game, that was scripted for a particular place in the story. But actually most of it, the vast majority of it, was just great material that they grabbed and was free of narrative and could be used anywhere. So, a shot of an out of focus horse in the stable. It felt like that could go anywhere in the story. It could be a part of a montage at the beginning or end, or it could be a little vision that's sort of interspersed. So, and it was just, in editing terms, it was a question of finding the right place for those. I mean, that particular shot of the horse just felt right after she's taken her hazmat suit off and encountered the alien closely, to coin a phrase, and it felt like there was some sense of meeting another kind of beast, you know, or an elephant in the mist when she meets these aliens and sees the skin texture, which we dwell on, you know. Building those up and building the rhythm to them. There's, you know, when you first have the vision, there's no sound, for example, and then gradually there's a little moment where a child is scraping the surface of the water with a stick that looks strangely like a heptapod's leg, and then there's a she turfs over a little pebble and there's a splash of water. You know, it's the first. So we're delicately building it so that you have this sense of somebody potentially losing their marbles as they seem to be stricken by grief. So it was very free. We were very free in lots of ways. I mean, we were free in that we could do anything we wanted with the aliens. I mean, there was plans, obviously, and models and creature design, but their movements was structured in post. We were free with the flashback material, or the memory material, if you want to call it that. That could go pretty much anywhere, and we changed that a lot, the flavor of it. And then we're also free with the kind of backdrop of the world news, because all of those, there's thousands of screens in the film, and they were all shot green screens, so that we could work out later how to kind of build this sense of mounting paranoia and the world falling apart. And, you know, it's a lot of work. It's writing news reports, and it's you know, doing pickup shoots with presenters, TV presenters, and you know, there's a wall with about 200 screens on it at the end. So it's, you know, it's a lot. We're, you know, trying to tell the story of the world as well. So, you know, we had a lot of freedom.
Right. It's a movie I really look forward to seeing again, just to see the ways that you guys drop hints and construct these things through editing. You mentioned special effects earlier and looking at guys in green suits with tennis balls. When you're doing your first cut, are you going off of pre-visualizations, or you know, how do you know how it's ultimately going to look?
Well, there were sort of two ways into that. One is that Denis works with a fantastic storyboard artist, Sam Hudetsky, and he's worked on Prisoners and Enemy and Sicario, and he's now working on Blade Runner. And they work very closely with Bradford in this case, or with Roger on Sicario, and they'd sit around the table, and it's way more than a storyboard. I mean, it's a kind of, yes, it's a shot list, but it's also a kind of conceptual, logical workout. And there were some very beautiful indications of what the heptapods would look like, even in the early storyboards before they started shooting. There was some small amount of previs, but that was all basically, you know, static shots. And, you know, I worked to a degree with that. But actually, the big secret for me was that very early in the fine cut, about a week in, I was very struck by the work that Dave Whitehead and Michelle Child, they're a pair of New Zealand sound designers, is languages, alien languages, or creature languages. And they've done a lot of work, obviously, on things like District 9, where they invented an almost complete bug language, totally holistic approach to it. They're made of many meticulous layers of sound, but they have a kind of syntax, and they sound convincingly like a language. And I was saying to Denny, you know, this would be a very, very useful tool to help us time things and to allow enough time for things, and to also influence the animation, because we just didn't want two little puppets in there for you know, 5 major scenes. They had to kind of give away elements of character and philosophical attitude, and there had to be differences between them. One is meant to be, you know, they're called Abbott and Costello in the story. One is short and squat, and the other is tall and thin, and they have differences between them in maybe age. So, you know, trying to convey that using sound has helped a lot. You know, very early they came back with an amazing interpretation, which barely changed, I have to tell you, in the course of another 9 months, which is really robust. And that was always a sort of, you know, for a long time we're not looking at anything in all these cuts, but if you can hear them, then it helps you imagine them. So that was really my strategy. It was I mean, I often come at things from a sound perspective, and that's my background. I was a composer and a sound editor at one stage, and I think, you know, way more about sound than perhaps I should for the schedule.
Well, the sound is very dominant in this film, and it really does make a difference in selling the reality of these creatures, you know, and of the most important aspect of this film, the language, you know. So you mentioned Blade Runner, and I do want to ask you about that. Certainly, I don't want any spoilers, but you know, what was the I guess, inspiration for you guys, for you and Denny, and this great team that's been working on all these different movies, to go and do a sequel to a sci-fi classic?
This is Denny's fault. I blame him entirely. You know, it's so difficult. I'd love to tell you about it, but of course I'd just, you know, I'd have to kill you. So, I don't know what to say about it, except that, you know, we just had our, you know, we've just come back from Hungary. I'm in sunny Culver City now, and we're ensconced, and we had an amazing shoot in Budapest, really quite extraordinary. You know, I suppose we're going to just have to, you know, there's a bit of a joke going around on set that people were sort of pointing laser pens at each other's chests, just to get us all used to being, you know, targets come this time next year. I don't know. I mean, it seems like a kind of logical step to me. I mean, you know, for somebody who loves sci-fi as Denny does and as I do, it just, and the scope and the scale and the kind of vision of it is just, you know, it's irresistible. And Blade Runner should have had a sequel many years ago, in my view.
Well, hopefully next year we can talk about it. I'm certainly looking forward to it. Lastly, I wanted to ask you, I know you got to go and edit this film, but you are an Oscar nominee for 12 Years a Slave. What does that kind of recognition mean for you in your career?
So, you know, one of the funniest things about that is that, you know, there are two sides to it. One said, somebody said to me, you know, the best thing is that you'll always be Oscar nominated. And I was sort of very toughed up by somebody saying that. I thought, that's really great. And it had been introduced on stage as Oscar nominated. You know, it was very but my daughter, Matilda, at one stage did actually use the words Oscar nominated as an insult, which I think is incredible. Said something like, you know, we were having an argument about something minor, and she said, you know, it's all very well for you, Oscar nominated Joe Walker. I just thought, you know, I mean, there's life and there's the film industry, and although they're very heavily intertwined in my case, because I'm very dedicated to what I do, there's still real life out there. It's like the Hollywood sign, you know, it's an iconic, you know, sign that we all recognize around the world. But actually, when you go up and walk around it, you realize it's just corrugated tin, rather badly painted.
Well, Joe Walker, it's always a pleasure speaking with you, and congratulations on Arrival. It's a great movie. Thank you so much.
Yeah, great to talk to you. Thank you.
You're welcome. Have a good one.